Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in AQA A-level sociology. This lesson is going to think about the idea of human rights and state crimes, specifically focusing on things like genocide, torture, and human rights abuses. Now, human rights and fundamental freedoms are those that are enshrined to every single individual. You are given the rights, human rights, by simple virtue of being a human being. That's the sort of basic theoretical approach. Of course, philosophers of human rights will debate this for years and years and years, but that's essentially the basic theoretical foundation that we have here. Human rights are also protected by international laws and treaties. And so, despite the global recognition of human rights, state crimes will often involve, therefore, violations of human rights perpetrated by governments or state actors, whether that be directly or indirectly. And so ultimately, human rights violations and state crimes are deeply interrelated, as states are both political entities, but they are also enforcers of the law, and can become perpetrators of crimes that violate an individual's basic rights. These crimes can be committed during times of war, under authoritarian regimes, or as just simple parts of efforts to try and suppress and to dissent, or to try and suppress dissident and dissent with the use of police control. The international community has put in place various different frameworks to try and maintain or to try and address, should I say, the prevention of human rights abuses. And these efforts can be hindered by political interests, state sovereignty, and the power dynamics that exist within an international system. Generally speaking, then, human rights violations occur when a government or their agents, the sort of extensions of the government, like the police, for example, fail to respect the civil, political, economic, social, or cultural rights of those individuals. These violations may involve acts of discrimination, of oppression, of torture, or even the commission of genocide, and can result from systemic policies or individual actions. Civil and political rights include things like the right to life, freedom of expression, and the right to a fair trial, and will often be a category that, if violated, involves things like the unlawful imprisonment of an individual, political persecution, or restrictions on free speech. By contrast, then, economic, social, and cultural rights are the kind of rights that allow or ensure that an individual has basic access to needs such as food, shelter, education, and healthcare. Violations of such rights might include forced displacement, the denial of education, or the displacement of indigenous groups from their land. State crimes, then, are crimes or criminal acts that are committed by government officials, or agents of the state, or others that are working on behalf of the state. These crimes are serious because they are not just violations of national laws, but they will also constitute breaches of international law as well. These crimes are typically sanctioned by the state itself or will occur within the context of particular state policies. They might include, for example, violations of the laws of war, which takes place and would represent war crimes. It might even be the idea of genocide, which I'll get to later on, or also torture. The intentional infliction of severe physical or psychological pain on an individual to extract information or to just intimidate dissenters. So what are war crimes then, and how do we think about what war crimes are? Well, they are violations of the laws and customs of war that are designed to protect non-combatants, prisoners of war, and civilians. So, in order for someone to commit a war crime, it has to be agreed that there is a war. That is the first thing. War crimes only exist during armed conflicts. Now, the type of law that we refer to when thinking about how to regulate armed conflicts, to protect people in war once a war has taken place, is a type of law that we describe as international humanitarian law, often abbreviated as IHL. Now, The regulation of international humanitarian law is done under a number of different instruments, including but not limited to the Geneva Conventions. We often hear about the Geneva Conventions. It's plural. There's more than one Geneva Conventions. There's in fact 4 that take place that are established in 1949, and then there's 2 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. You also have the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the convention or the treaty that establishes the International Criminal Court, that it regulates war crimes as well. Now, war crimes can exist in various different modes or various different types, but the most egregious of them include things like targeting civilians. If you would deliberately attack a civilian population or civilian infrastructure, like schools, hospitals, and homes, this is considered a violation of IHL. This is considered a war crime. Now, there is essentially within international humanitarian law, there's a whole broad collection of rules that are associated with targeting, the rules associated with who you can and cannot target, and what things you have to do in order to be allowed to target an individual, to shoot an individual, or to call in an airstrike on a particular area, on a particular target. These involve a principle known as proportionality. So the attack that you do has to be proportional to the military advantage that you expect. So, for example, if there is just maybe 2 or 3 soldiers in the distance, and in order to target them, in order to kill those soldiers, you have to drop an airstrike on them. That might not be proportional to the advantage you would get from just killing 2 soldiers in a broad, big conflict. But compare that to the fact that, let's say, you have the enemy army's HQ in your sights. Then that would be more proportional because it would incur quite a substantial military advantage. You also have to adhere to the principle of distinction. You have to always distinguish between combatants, those you're allowed to kill, and non-combatants. Non-combatants include civilians. They include injured soldiers. They include people who are hors de combat, which means that they are out of action. Essentially, they are no longer representing a threat to you, and also POWs, people who have surrendered. And then finally, there is this idea of precaution. You have to take the appropriate precautions to minimize the amount of incidental harm to civilians. Now, a civilian dying in war, if an airstrike happens in a war and civilians die, that doesn't automatically mean it's a war crime. Civilians are expected to die in war. The point of IHL is to try and reduce that as much as possible, but it is probably impossible to reduce that all the way down to 0. You also have the use of prohibited weapons, so weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. We have lots of treaties that have been signed by lots of countries around the world that bans chemical weapons, that bans biological weapons, that bans landmines or cluster munitions or any different kinds of things like that. Killing POWs, executing prisoners of war, is also considered a war crime once that person has surrendered, once they have put down their arms and they have put their hands up and they have indicated to you that they are surrendering. You are no longer allowed to target those individuals. They become what is known as hors de combat. Now, examples of war crimes might be seen when looking at images of torture during the war in Iraq, the Abu Ghraib prison or Ghraib prison. Now, you have to make a delineation and a distinction between illegal wars and war crimes. So, an illegal war is like the war in Iraq, but we distinguish in international law between the laws that are used to regulate whether or not a country can go to war versus laws that exist once a country has gone to war. So, the laws that exist regulating whether or not a country is allowed to go to war is known as the jus ad bellum, the law on the use of force. But once a country is at war, regardless of if that country has gone to war illegally or not illegally, the jus in bello, the international humanitarian law, exists and is always present. So the war in Iraq, for example, was unlawful. It was illegal. It did not meet any of the requirements that were necessary for going to war. So things like self-defense of a country or collective security, but using the Security Council, it did not meet any of those standards. But regardless of whether or not the war itself was illegal, the actions that you do when you're in that conflict have to also follow the law. So there's a distinction that we make there. Genocide involves essentially the intentional and the systematic destruction of a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The Genocide Convention is the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2 defines what genocide is. Now, the thing that you do in law, in criminal law, is distinguish between two different types of liability. You distinguish between the acts that are committed, and then you distinguish that between the mental state that you have. The fancy Latin, for those of you who go on to study law in the future, or who are maybe doing A-level law, is the actus reus, the acts, and the mens rea, the mental state. And so for genocide, it involves a number of different acts, but it has to be done with a very specific intent. You have to do these acts with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. That is the definition of genocide. And the acts include things like killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, imposing measures that prevent births in the group, deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, and the transfer of children from one group to another group. Those are the things that you can do. Those are the acts that you can do, but in order for those acts to be genocide, it has to be done with the specific intent to commit genocide. So, for example, a war crime could include killing a group, a member of a group. Let's say I go to Iraq, and during the Iraq War, I was a soldier, and I committed a war crime by killing a civilian, an Iraqi civilian. That would constitute one of the acts in genocide, but if I didn't do it with the intention to destroy Iraqi soldiers or Iraqi population or whatever, or the entire destruction of a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, then it wouldn't constitute genocide. That's what distinguishes genocide from war crimes and from crimes against humanity. With crimes against humanity, they are crimes that are committed as part of a widespread and systematic destruction. So there's a sense of scale with a crime against humanity. With genocide, there isn't actually a sense of scale. Theoretically, one person could commit genocide by killing one other person, so long as they do so with a very specific intent. Examples of genocides are the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where Hutu militia orchestrated a genocide against the Tutsi population, which killed around 800,000 Tutsis, as well as some moderate Hutus were killed over a period of around 100 days. It was carried out with state support and with state officials, and later was tried by a tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR. Another example is, of course, the Holocaust, perpetrated by the Third Reich, one of the most infamous instances of genocide in history. The Nazi regime systematically murdered 6 million Jews, as well as others, millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and homosexuals. The scale and the brutality of the Holocaust led to the establishment of the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were the sort of first example of international criminal justice that existed as the in and around the same time as the establishment of the UN. Torture, then, is the deliberate infliction of severe pain or suffering, either physically or mentally, with the purpose of obtaining information, punishment, intimidation, coercion, etc., etc. It is prohibited by a number of conventions, such as the Convention Against Torture, which is considered to be a grave violation of human rights. Now, there are certain rules in international law that you as a sociology student don't really need to know, and there's fancy Latin that I've already mentioned that, again, you as a sociology student do not need to know, but torture and genocide specifically, and other things such as slavery and apartheid, are examples of what we describe in international law as, they're sometimes called jus cogens obligations, J-U-S Cogen, C-O-G-E-N, obligations. Now, what these essentially are basically, for the layman, a principle of international law that is so fundamental that any attempt to violate that principle would automatically render any agreement of that nature void or unable to be enforced. So, for example, if I was a country, if I was the UK, and I wanted to sign a treaty with France that said that we are going to commit genocide against Germany, okay, that treaty would be void and null and have no legal effect automatically because it would violate a jus cogens norm. Torture is another example of one of those norms that are just so fundamental to human dignity and to human rights that we just all collectively agree that there's no justification. Whatever happens, if you violate this convention, if you even try to violate this convention, you can't. It is against the law, no matter what. We can see examples of the use of torture following the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. The US government, along with its allies, committed a number of counter-terrorism tactics, some of which involved the use of torture. The enhanced interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay, for example, included things like waterboarding and led to significant controversy. We see also examples of human rights abuses under authoritarian regimes. They often engage in widespread human rights abuses. An example of this is under the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile between 1973 and 1990. This is where thousands of individuals in Chile were tortured, disappeared, or killed as part of a state campaign against political dissent.